Hi, and welcome to our next lesson as we go through the Gospels. And one of the questions we often have as we read it is, what's the deal with Judas? And so that's what we're going to look at today is, why does Judas do what he does? Of all the people in the Bible, he's probably by many considered to be the biggest villain, the least liked person in the Bible. It's one thing for the people who oppose Jesus, but for a friend, for a trusted disciple to betray him, to be the one that hands him over to be killed, one who had been with him through his ministry and seen the miracles. There is the question of, why did Judas do what he did? And we can see, if you look in Mark chapter 14, and I'll turn there, it talks a little there about Judas and his betrayal of Jesus and his plans. And it says, now the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and kill him, but not during the feast, they said, or the people may riot. So Jesus is very popular. And as we talked about in our last lesson, what Jesus was doing was undermining a lot of what the religious leaders were working toward, their goals for the nation, their goals for themselves, and everything that had developed over hundreds of years through their traditions and their teaching of the Talmud. And so Jesus is a very big threat to them. So they had reasons, but notice what they said: a sly way. What's a way we can get him arrested without anybody noticing, before anybody can oppose us? How do we do this? And how do we accomplish this? So they're looking for a way, but they also know if they try to do it in public, when everybody's around Jesus, that the people will riot. So there is no easy way for them to just go and to arrest Jesus. And it says, while he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. And so we're going to get a little more insight into Judas later in this text, but it looks like Judas is the main one protesting this extravagant use of a valuable item on Jesus. Apparently, Judas just thinks this is wasted, but we'll see there's another motive underlying that in another text. Leave her alone, said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. But then notice what it says next. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So Judas's wheels are turning, and he goes to the priests. Just as they're looking for this opportunity to arrest Jesus, he goes to them and offers to find a way to help them arrest Jesus. So that's the question as we look at this is why did Judas betray Jesus? Why did he do this? So there are a lot of questions. Why did Judas betray Jesus? It just doesn't make sense for somebody who has been with Jesus, who has seen the miracles that he's done. Why does Judas betray him? I mean, it seems like such a small price. What is his gain in betraying Jesus? What is Judas really trying to work here? What are his goals? What's his plan? I mean, was it just something simply that he didn't like Jesus? Judas is just tired of Jesus? Is that it? I don't really think that's the reason. Was it the 30 pieces of silver? I don't think that's enough either. I want us to dig in and see, why would Judas do this thing? Why would he betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver? Now, we know directly that's what he received, but there's a lot more at play here and a lot more going on uh, than just what we see on the surface, just as there was with the religious leaders and their use of the Talmud and the tradition. There's a lot more when we understand more of what's going on. So, what do we know about Judas? One thing we know is that he was greedy. Uh, we can see that. I think the 30 pieces of silver was just a bonus um, to what he was already going to do. Notice before they agreed to pay him, he went to them. He went to them looking for an opportunity, an offering. And another thing is that he stole from the bag. So let's look at John chapter 12. And it says this, carrying that same account. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. So we see more of the account that Judas is the one that kind of started this grumbling, and maybe the other disciples or some others there jumped in and said, "Yeah, that's a good point." But notice what it says in verse 6: He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. And so, the 30 pieces of silver, again, to me, cannot really be the motive, because Judas uh, had a thing where he was just taking the money. He was tracking the money, he took it in, and he could take out what he wanted. And so 30 pieces of silver was a very cheap price compared to what he was gaining. So he was going to lose out in the long run. So we know he's greedy. We know that he is a thief, taking from what they have. But here's another aspect that I think we definitely have to consider. I fully believe that Judas believed Jesus was the Messiah. I don't think that he doubted that. And so, like the other disciples, he thinks Jesus will be a king Messiah, though. As we understand Jesus and what God promised in saying that he would send a Messiah, they don't understand that, and they still don't understand that. But they do believe that he is the Messiah, the one God promised to send. And like the other disciples, Judas wanted Jesus to reveal himself to the world. They were ready for this time that he would make the announcement and he would become the king. But they've been traveling for 3 years. They weren't staying in luxurious accommodations. Uh, and I think Judas especially is kind of growing tired of this. He looks forward to the time when he will be rich. Now, this is what the Talmud says about the Messiah. And I want us to look at that because that gives us an understanding. And again, for more information on this, you can go to a previous lesson. It gives a lot of insight as we understand the Talmud. But basically, the Talmud was the interpretation of the scriptures, which is given, which they gave as much weight as the scripture themselves. So this understanding of the Messiah was seen as scriptural, even though it doesn't spell it out quite like that. And it says, the king will arise and reestablish the monarchy of David as it was in former times. He will build the sanctuary and gather in the dispersed of Israel. All the earlier statutes will be restored as they once were. Sacrifices will be offered. The sabbatical and jubilee years will be observed as commanded in the Torah. Anyone who does not believe in him, or one who does not anticipate his coming, not only denies the prophets, but also the Torah and Moses, our teacher. And so they definitely believed in the Messiah. They definitely believed Jesus was the Messiah. But look at what they believe. He will be a king like David. And if you know something about David and Solomon, his son, they had untold wealth. That Israel was very powerful, but also very prosperous. And so they see Jesus as this kind of king. And I think that's the thing we have to understand when we look at Judas betraying Jesus, that they think when he announces the messiahship, he's going to be this very wealthy king. And so some of the disciples are they're arguing about who gets to sit on his right and his left, and they're kind of jockeying for position and roles for where they will be when Jesus declares his messiahship. And I believe Judas, more than his role, is looking at having access to one of the greatest treasuries in the world when Jesus is the Messiah. But so far, Jesus hasn't declared that. In fact, he's talking about being arrested. He's talking about his death. And as they try to figure out what he means by his resurrection, by his rising from the dead. And so all this is going on. At the same time, they believe he is the Messiah, that he is the one who will be this king. So following the Last Supper, or during the Last Supper, Jesus predicts his betrayal, basically pinpoints Judas, but the other apostles, the other disciples, they really don't comprehend what Jesus is telling Judas to do when he says, what you have to do, go and do quickly. They thought it was some job that Jesus has given him, but Judas goes to betray him. Meanwhile, they have their meal, then they go out and they pray, and Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane where he's praying, and it's at that time that Judas has gone and gotten the information. So they go out with some soldiers to arrest Jesus. And this is another thing, that they have to know where Jesus is, to be able to be betrayed. It's hard to find people at night. People would wonder why is this detachment of soldiers going around everywhere if they were simply searching for him. It would arouse suspicion, probably cause people to look and see what's going on. So they need a place, a private place, a way they can just show up and get a hold of Jesus. And again, they don't have street lights. They don't have flashlights. All they really have are torches. So it's dark. And so even when Judas gets there, he has to make sure that he identifies who Jesus is. And so he goes up and greets him with a kiss, which is a traditional greeting to identify Jesus. But it says in the scripture, when they go to arrest him, they even fall back. And Jesus repeats his question is, who are you looking for? And he answers that he is Jesus. He is the one. So Jesus even announces that, and they arrest Jesus and they take him to the trials. Now, I want us to look at Matthew 27. We'll look at verses 1 through 5. So Jesus goes through his trials. They bring in false witnesses. They abuse Jesus. And then it says, early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders of the people came to the decision to put Jesus to death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. Now, for a man who is after his 30 pieces of silver, and if this is what he expected, then why would he be seized with remorse? I think Judas even loved Jesus. Not only did he believe in who Jesus was, but I believe that he loved Jesus and cared for him. But when Jesus was arrested, I mean, remember, Judas saw Jesus calm a storm. He saw the miracles. He saw the feeding of 5,000 people. He saw Jesus walk on water. I don't think there's any way that Judas believes that Jesus can be arrested and put to death. I think Judas thinks that will force Jesus' hand to declare himself the Messiah. That is what Judas is trying to do, is to end this 3 years of traveling, these 3 years of ministry, and force Jesus to admit to the world who he is and to take the throne. And then Judas will have access to all that money. But when he sees that Jesus is arrested and when he's condemned to death, notice that's when it says that Judas is seized with remorse. That this is not what Judas expected when Jesus is sent to Pilate. So he gives them the money back even. And they say, when he says he's betrayed innocent blood, "What is that to us?" They replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Judas is so caught with remorse of what he has done in betraying Jesus that he goes out and he kills himself, because this is not what he has expected. And then he sees what he has done, that not even the 30 pieces of silver is worth anything to him. And this gives you a little insight into the religious leaders as well. As they say, the chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." And that just gives you the insight that these righteous guys, well, it's beyond us to use blood money. We're too good for that. That would be unrighteous. But they're the ones using blood money. It was from them. So that just gives you an insight into these men and their kind of false righteousness, that they'll use blood money to get someone to betray Jesus, and they'll use false witnesses in a trial, but it's against the law to use blood money. So they can't do that. And it says, so they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. But notice, this was a prophecy regarding the Messiah that had to be fulfilled. And it says, then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. And that phrase is still used, that where people that couldn't be buried, didn't have money, foreigners traveling through, that's where they would be buried, in that field. And so we get a little more insight into the religious leaders, but also Judas, that he did not expect this to lead to the cross. He did not expect it to lead to Jesus' execution. And before anything happens, Judas hangs himself and he returns the money. So ultimately, why did Judas do what he did? I believe that after 3 years of waiting for Jesus to declare himself the Messiah, the King of Israel, he tries to force Jesus to the throne, and therefore having access to untold wealth. But Jesus goes to the cross, and since what Judas expected didn't happen, in light of his betrayal leading to the death of a friend, he hangs himself. And I think we have a good lesson for this in Judas. Judas had the belief, he had the belief in who Jesus was, but he didn't trust in God's plan. He didn't trust in what God was doing. And the scripture tells us to trust in the Lord with all our heart and to not lean on our own understanding. And so it's important for us, when things don't make sense, when they're not clear, to trust God, be faithful with what he tells us to do, to take that step. Because I think that was the problem with Judas, was that his own selfish ambitions got in the way of trusting in what God was doing and in Jesus' work